We're going to talk about the congruent supplement theorem now. And recall, we have to prove theorems before we can use them in proofs. And so that is what the main goal of this video is. Okay, so the congruent supplement theorem says that if two angles are supplements of the same angle, or of congruent angles, then the angles are congruent. So here we're given that angle 1 is supplementary to angle 2, and angle 3 is supplementary to angle 4. And we're also told that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. So we're asked to prove that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Okay, so we're going to start by writing down our given statements. Okay, so our first given statement is that angle 1 is supplementary to angle 2. And this is given. And again, I'm going to zoom in because it makes it easier to write. Okay, and then we're given that angle 3 is supplementary to angle 4. And this again is given information. Okay, and then step 3, we're going to, we're given one more piece, sorry, that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. And this again is given information. Okay, so now we're going to use this given information to come up with our next steps. Okay, so let's use some definitions. First, let's work with this angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. And we know that when two things are congruent to each other, that the measure of their angles are equal. So if angle 2 is congruent to angle 4, then the measure of angle 2 equals the measure of angle 4. Okay, and this is by definition of congruency. Definition of congruent. Now, step 5. Let's talk about some other definitions. Let's talk about the definition of supplementary, because we can use that twice. Okay, so the definition of supplementary says that if two angles are supplementary to each other, then their sum is 180 degrees. Okay, so by definition of supplementary, we can say that the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180 degrees. And that's by definition of supplementary. Okay. And then for step 6, we can say the exact same thing about angles 3 and angle 4. We can say that the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 4 is equal to 180 degrees. And again, this is by the definition of supplementary. Okay, so both of these, in steps 5 and 6, if both of these steps are equal to 180 degrees, then can we set them equal to each other? And the answer would be yes, you can. So the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 4. And what property allows me to do that? Well, hopefully you recall that it's the transitive property. And that's because we are replacing the entire side. So see, we have this 180 degrees here and 180 degrees here. So we're replacing the entire side. And because we're replacing the entire side of the equation, we can say that we're using the transitive property. Okay, now in step 8. Well, ooh, that was ugly. Okay, in step 8. do we see here that the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 4? Okay, so we've got this here, and we have this here. So if we can substitute the measure of angle 2 for the measure of angle 4, then we can have the measure of angle 2 on both sides of our equal sign. Okay, so if we do that next, we'll have the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 2. And this is by substitution. Now this cannot be by transitive because we're not replacing the entire side. We're just replacing a part. And the steps that we're using here are steps 4 and 7. Okay. And now if we subtract the measure of angle 2 from each side, because it's on both sides, so we can easily subtract it, we have the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 3. Okay, and that's by the subtraction property of equality. And then we can switch because our overall goal is to prove that the two angles are congruent to each other, not that they're equal. And so by definition of congruency, we can say that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. And that's by definition of congruent. Let me zoom out a little bit.